So my field is space physics, more specifically space plasma physics. And I'd like to say, as a scientist, I reject scientism. As a physicist, I reject physicalism. And there's very specific reasons for this that I outline in my work, Untying the Gordian Knot. That is that the way of knowing that is science is focused on model making from measurement outputs from the way of numbers that you can map into spreadsheets and you can work with in a quantitative way, and that our goal is this context-independent development of mathematical representations as the essence of the scientific process and model making. That's the way of numbers. And then we have the way of knowing that is the way of context, emphasizing context, as in the humanities, poetry, music, more inclusively. So that's the way of context, the way of semiotics, signs. So we have those two ways of knowing, of context independence, of context affirmation and emphasis, and the way, I would argue, of ultimate context. Three basic ways of knowing. Scientism claims that everything gets mapped down to, reduced to nothing but the way of numbers. This is simply false. And Aaron Gare has, in response to the problems of the mechanistic descriptions and reductionist models that end up leading us to think that values and meaning and feelings and experience are mere epiphenomena instead of something that's real in the world. In response to that, Aaron Gare calls us to affirming and developing a new natural philosophy for the 21st century. Something that goes beyond the corpuscular kinetic worldview of the 19th century as Milan Čapek had articulated it. Something that goes beyond the mere reductionism and scientism of the past century. Something that then can develop a framework of understanding that can help us all with the new ways of accommodating feelings and experience as an integral part of our reality for ourselves, for our community, for the world, and make a real difference. I think our panel in each of their own ways are contributing to that, and I'd like to just ask one question of the panel before we turn to questions from the audience. My question to each of you is, how do you see your work as contributing to a new natural philosophy for the 21st century?
Yeah, essentially, I think that my remit in the last 10 years of being at the Whitehead Research Project and working on the critical edition has been to provide new source text rather than doing my own interpreting. It's sort of a very different mindset. You want to keep your own interpretation out of it. But clearly, new critical editions of Whitehead's both published and unpublished work in these Harvard Lectures notes and this project that I was discussing of revisiting some compositional analysis of process and reality is going to provide more grist for the mill in terms of looking into Whitehead's philosophy and perspective on a new natural philosophy for the 21st century. And so I'm hoping to provide those resources, basically.
Very good, thanks.
So I wouldn't say my work contributes to developing a new natural philosophy, but rather maybe trying to renegotiate what it means to do natural philosophy. And the reason I say that is because for the last few years, I've actually been teaching in the social sciences at the University of Chicago, specifically in anthropology. All my colleagues are anthropologists, which is a big shift for me, having spent about 12 years at the divinity school there. And what I've found is that there are too many questions being broached in the social sciences about a non-representationalist, right, or anti-worldview understanding of alterity and difference, of disagreement, so in ethnographic research, for instance. And those anthropologists are very much drawing on Deleuze. They're not reading Whitehead. They're not reading the American Pragmatists, right? They're drawing on Deleuze because of the ontological account of the concept that is developed in a lot of his work. And I honestly think that Whitehead is better suited for their perspectivist approach that tries to get beyond a representationalist understanding of difference or alterity, and talks in rather ontological, non-epistemological terms of different worlds, right? Where perspectives are not wrong because they're plural, but it's precisely the plurality, right, and their relativity to one another that grounds them in a more critical realism. So in a sense, what I've found, though, is that you're not going to achieve your purposes in communicating this relevance by simply saying, like, look, here's the handbook on how to talk about reality, right? Here's a new natural philosophy. Whitehead's is the solution. Rather, you have to do things with it, right? You have to show how it's usable to certain applicable ends, which is precisely what I think Whitehead would have wanted, right? He's not going to say, let's only talk in terms of actual entities and prehensions, because he's not saying that those finally represent reality. And that's kind of the question that I was trying to address here. So in what sense is his system realist, pluralist, and relativist all for the same reason, in such a way that he actually authorizes us to use it and to move beyond it, right? In a way that doesn't, that kind of gives us a new metaphysics for what it means to do critical philosophy.
That's excellent. Thank you. Matt?
Just to respond to what you were saying, Lisa, I think you should give the Deleuzian anthropologist some Bruno Latour, because I think he draws on Whitehead and articulates this kind of pluralism in a really pragmatically inspired, but deeply process-inspired as well, philosophy of nature, and it's extremely applicable, and you can show what it can do across different fields, but they're probably aware of Latour already. In terms of philosophy of nature for the 21st century, I actually think we have a lot to learn still from the early 19th century German natural philosophers like Schelling, like Goethe. I think there's an alternative modern science that could have been born out of that period of research. And science took a different path, looking more into instrumental, technologically focused forms of research. And what I would say is it's not that technology and technoscience and instrumentalist approaches to building models that are operationalizable and so on, that's totally useless. Obviously, it's very useful, but what these German natural philosophers like Goethe and Schelling would point out is that when we forego our own healthy human sensory experience and replace it with the readings of these sophisticated detectors or telescopes or microscopes or whatever they may be, the universe revealed to us through these instruments is quite far removed from our embodied experience. And if Goethe was right that really the best scientific instrument we could ask for is our own human organism with its healthy suite of senses, then if we allow these instruments to take the lead when we do science, we run the risk of throwing our sense of reality out of proportion. And we do what I was trying to describe. We end up doing what I was trying to describe during my presentation of explaining our own concrete human experience by reference to some model constructed out of the abstractions that we use to interpret the data revealed by these instruments. And I think that's the wrong way around. And we can still do rigorous natural science on a more phenomenological basis, as, again, thinkers like Goethe and Schelling and later Whitehead, though with a speculative twist, would allow us to do. So that's what I would say to that question, Tim.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now for questions from the audience. And when you do speak up, please say your name and indicate who you'd like to respond to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, Goddard to Lisa. You were talking about Whitehead's theory of truth implicitly, and You can either have a metaphysical theory of truth, that truth is correspondence to the facts, or an epistemic, pragmatic. Those are basically the two models. Or you combine the two and say, well, the definition of truth is correspondence, but the only criterion we have is coherence, something pragmatic. And it's pretty hard to figure out what Whitehead's theory of truth is. Do you think he has a metaphysical theory of truth, and is it a kind of correspondence theory? And if it's not a correspondence theory, what is it? Or is it like what I just sketched, like Rascher mixes the two, say, well, the definition is correspondence, but the only criterion we have is coherence, epistemic. So I was trying to distill out of what you say, what is Whitehead's theory of truth? And I maybe you can help me to pinpoint more directly what you think what his theory of truth is.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You're right. I think there is simultaneously a sort of coherence theory of truth, a correspondence theory of truth, but not a correspondence of individual propositions and statements or words or ideas, right? But something more holistic in that sense. So, and that's why I wanted to draw on the idea of the matrix, the scheme as a matrix, and how truth functions only operate within a matrix, right? A sort of system. And so I was trying to parse out what he was saying about the scheme as a logical matrix, right, in which true propositions can come to be articulated in the logical sense or in the linguistic sense, but how he consistently says that their truth is only understandable in terms of clearly defined limits, right? And so I see him as kind of struggling with that, honestly. Is not really wanting to give a direct theory of truth, but almost kind of deflating the notion a little bit and having it be very perspectival. But at the same time, he's not relativistic, right? He's not saying that anything goes. He's very much saying there are correct methods of generalization, right? These are as you mentioned, right? Coherence is one of the best regulative ideals for producing an effective scheme of ideas. And there are certainly ways of thinking that he wants to correct. But I think first and foremost, you need to have a systematic universe of meaning, a matrix, right? And before you can even begin to deduce true propositions from it or to make helpful statements. And so I think that the relativity of the scheme, the interrelation of ideas is really fundamental. And I think he never wants us to lose sight of the fact that what we're doing in philosophy, right, is working with language, right, working to divulge the presuppositions of language itself and not to be representing facts in a self-sustained way. So, yeah, I wouldn't say there is one true or one clear theory of truth in Whitehead's work. I think he just very much is trying to show the efficacy of properly formulated propositions.
Hi, Nicholas Rosinski, and my comment, question, loving challenge, invitation speaks primarily to Matt's contribution. So it's a very welcome exploration of physics and feeling, and I want to ground my comment in feeling that has only really been fleetingly present for me over the past day or so, when John referred to the possibility of sort of civilization scale apocalypse. And metaphysics is beautiful, but I think the feelings of anguish and despair and impotence and hopefully urgency that's born of not of fear but of intelligence are something that we can bring to this consideration. So my central comment, lovingly, Matt, is I think that you're bringing a metaphysical knife to a civilization-scale gunfight here. And my question, you say in your paper something like, it's not a metaphysician's job to do experiments, and that's certainly true. But it's surely somebody's job to advocate for experiments that will lead to the changes in civilization scale dynamics that you're passionately and correctly advocating for. So let me try and give an example that might be relevant to this, my understanding of this group here. God and Christ have no hands but mine. So when spirit is speaking to me through consciousness, the matter dynamics of this body must be changed compared to what physical science has to say. So there's experiments there. They're not about iPads flying up to the ceiling. They're about the relationship between consciousness and matter. So my question is, why are we so scared of getting our hands dirty in science and advocating for an experimental approach to an expanded naturalism where consciousness and matter talk to each other?
I certainly, thank you for your comment and that question. I certainly wouldn't want to discourage experimental scientists from doing, whether it's neuroscientific research or sociological research or whatever form it takes, to understand how what we call consciousness can interact with what we call matter. My project, which maybe bringing a knife to a gunfight is one way of looking at it. I'm trying to use a scalpel and be delicate in my treatment of science and physics. I want to understand before I criticize as best that I can without having the decades plus worth of mathematical training to grasp the real details of it. But the question for me as a metaphysician with the scalpel's knife is, well, what do we mean by consciousness and what do we mean by matter? And before we do the experiments, can we arrive at to put those terms in a metaphysical context wherein we all know what we're talking about? I think we were speaking yesterday about how there's no real definition of matter in physics, nor do they much care to try to define it. It's more about making predictions that the next particle accelerator can hopefully verify or not. And what it is that they're interacting with is, they have names for it, but what is it? No, they don't care. I would like to know the is questions, and I think we need a metaphysics that can provide us with some way of grokking and making sense of the data and the theories of physics, so that we can then relate it to our own consciousness. But I'm certainly not opposed to experimental work, to speak the language of scientists, as it were, to open them to the possibility that the universe cannot be exhaustively explained just by reference to the physical side of the equation. So we should talk more about what experiments might be done here. But yeah, thank you.
Nancy Frankenberry. This question is for Joe. Simple informational question. But first, I should say congratulations. I think what you are producing is historic. It's of real importance. The question is, obviously this is a long-range project, but when do you expect the critical edition of Whitehead to be completed?
Completed, huh? Wild guess, 2045, 50? I'm not kidding. We produced 2 volumes so far, and there were 4 years between them, and we're planning on having, I think, 17 volumes. It's going to be a little while. Our current plans, just for a little bit of information, is we've done first the first two volumes of Harvard lectures. There's going to be 6 of those, but we're taking a temporary pause and doing 2 volumes of Whitehead's collected essays and articles. So that's the next thing we're working on that we'll be putting out, and we're hoping that those are going to be out in about 2 years. And those should be really helpful because it's putting everything in a chronological order and restoring, in some cases, some of these articles had been cut down as they'd been published later. Some of them haven't been seen at all. We found two great essays in papers donated by Whitehead's grandson that no one had seen. And so they're going to be great resources, but it's going to take a while. It's basically me and Brian Henning working on it, and we're bringing in other editors as needed for some of the individual volumes, but we can only do so much.
This question is for Dr. Segall. Thanks so much for your paper. It was so good. I could ask a ton of questions, but the one thing that that was like really, I know that you love history, and I was wondering about your reflections on that transition in worldview. So you mentioned that Kant really sees God in math, and then about 100 or so years later, people and scientists are looking at math and saying that's the reason why God doesn't exist. That's a huge transition in thinking. Do you have any thoughts on how that flip emerged?
It's extremely complicated, but I think I would want to resist the typical version of that story, which is Charles Taylor calls it the subtraction thesis, that basically superstitious belief was removed and all that was left was the scientific facts, and we gradually just came to accept the picture of nature that science was revealing and didn't need any theological backdrop for it. But I think it's much more complicated than that. Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, does a great job of giving a sort of thick description of all the sociological factors that go into this. It's much more than just a matter of science advancing in its knowledge of nature. It's a moral transformation, it's a cultural shift, political, I think the French Revolution has a lot to do with it. If you understand the sorts of metaphors and analogies that work in the subterranean level of the human psyche when you execute the king and get rid of this ancient ordering of society and start fresh with totally rationalized laws and calendar, and everything starting fresh, as was the attempt of the French Revolution, you can see how it also follows that the whole idea of the need for a divine lawgiver to order the universe also doesn't matter. Human beings begin to deify themselves, and if the world has any meaning or purpose, it's because we create it and bring it into the world. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated picture. Darwin, several decades after, 50 or 60 years after Kant had passed, develops his theory of natural selection, which also accelerated this process of people taking on a more naturalistic worldview. So it's a very good question, and it would take a whole seminar to unpack all of the factors there, but it's striking to see how quickly that shift occurred.
I think.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentations. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. My question for Lisa was taken away by Goddard. It was going in the same direction, but I do want to mention a really great source I find that are the last 2 pages of The Aims of Education, especially the last 2 paragraphs of the entire book. Whitehead writes there, I emphasize the point that our only exact data as to the physical world are our sensible perceptions. We must not slip into the fallacy of assuming that we are comparing a given world with the given perceptions of it. The physical world is, in some general sense of the term, a deduced concept. Our problem is, in fact, to fit the world to our perceptions and not our perceptions to the world. And I find that to be a very, and previously he talks about a certain superstructure that we can find in our perceptions of the world. And that's basically where his theory of truth is grounded. And so I just wanted to share that. But I have a question for Matthew, because I work a lot with practitioners of all sorts, namely also farmers, foresters, gardeners, and scientists of these environmental fields. And my experience is that they have a very strong sense of maybe intuition, but I would maybe rather call it empathy. And in your first like in your first comment after your presentation, you mentioned to use your body as a scientific tool or as a tool for measurement. And I personally feel like the empathic connection that we can build up with a plant, for example, or with another person, we can immediately tell whether they're healthy or not. And we can also tell whether an ecosystem is flourishing or not. So I was wondering if you can, in your experience with scientists and also in your academic perspective, could you see empathy as a form of like a research methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. So briefly, part of what I do in the paper is attempt to overcome Hume's is-ought dichotomy and, Whitehead's understanding that every fact is the expression of some value allows us to do that in a way that isn't silly, that isn't just a matter of doing what Hume was worried, where you derive an is, or you derive an ought from an is, which we don't want to fall prey to that sort of thing. But in terms of the methodology of empathy, or what Goethe called delicate empiricism, where very much in the domain of botany, Goethe developed this methodology of perceiving the growth of plants in such a way that his own imagination, through a sort of sympathetic resonance, and I would say in Whitehead's terms, through a prehension of propositional feelings active in the plant itself that one can come to share as the observer, Goethe was able to gain insight into what he described as a kind of dynamic archetypal pattern that's expressing itself in the plant. And this harkens back to ancient Greek conception in Aristotle of how we come to know the forms of things through a sort of sympathetic resonance. And that has been lost after Kant, the Descartes and Kant, and this whole modern philosophical and scientific development that led us not to trust our senses and instead to trust mathematical models. And I think we need to recover what's been lost, because losing that sympathetic contact with the world and the capacity to take it seriously as a deliverance of real facts and values it's basically we've decapitated ourselves. So, yeah. Thanks for that question.
We're running over time, so I think at most 2 more questions. I know we have 1 question in front. What do you have back there, Andrew? Okay, 1 question there, 1 question here.
We need to conclude after this question.
Okay, please speak up.
Thank you. This question is for Matt. You specifically brought in Goethe's empiricism, and in doing so, you said healthy sense perception. And I was wondering how much there might be room for atypical experiences that are not the average in that as well. And I imagine in Whitehead there is a little bit more, but I was wondering for Goethe and Schelling, how much room there is for the creation of something new through our new senses, or maybe even the development of new sense perceptions that haven't been developed yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. By healthy, I mean, in a sense, our senses are like muscles, and we have to cultivate them for them to become capable of accurate perception. Musicians have very cultivated hearing, and painters have very cultivated eyesight, and you don't automatically develop that sort of skill unless you train. And I do absolutely think that there are, as it were, other organs of perception that are kind of dormant within us that can be developed. Goethe and Schelling thought of the imagination as such an organ, which we all, just by nature, instinctually have the capacity for some degree of imaginative reflection and speculation and dreaming and so on. But you can actually, Goethe thought, cultivate imagination as an organ of perception that gives us insight into the formative processes of the organic world, right? And so it's not that anyone can just do it. It's very easy to project onto what you're observing. But Goethe thought with training, you can come to actually participate in what you're observing, the plant, let's say, you can participate into its formative processes of growth and be in sympathy with it so that you're not projecting. In a way, you're absorbing, right, what's there, but that your physical eyes aren't able to see without this imaginative organ of perception. So yeah, I think that's absolutely possible.
We're going to need to conclude. So join me, a very rich dialogue. We've thank you, Tim, and to the panelists.